Thank you everyone for joining the call. We had a very popular call last month run by our speakers here, Kalyan, Salman, and Tugan. Thanks a lot, folks, for that interesting call. We had a lot of folks joining that call, and in fact, we've got good number of YouTube views as well. And there's a lot of talk and buzz about how the call went. We have a similar topic this month as well. The only change being it's going to be an Angular framework. And again, run by Dogan, Salman, and Kalyan. Some quick pointers as usual. This call gets recorded, so let's try to be friendly on the call. Please feel free to ask in your questions. We would love to know your experiences. We have the calls recorded and posted at that link, which is aka.ms m365pnp/videos. And then we have a survey that will be shared on the chat window. It's really important for us to know your experience of the call because that helps us plan the call as well as speakers get to know what was the experience and feedback on the call. It's a quick 3-minute question survey. Feel free to put in your questions for the content that we're presenting. And as always, we have interesting calls lined up every month. That's the third Thursday every month. Tune into this live event and enjoy the call. Over to you, Kalyan.
Thank you, Nandish. Hey, welcome for today's session. My name is Kalyan Krishna. I'm a product manager in the Microsoft Identity Division. I'm here with developers in my team, Doan and Salman. We are going to basically have walkthrough of how to integrate your Angular JavaScript applications with Microsoft's Identity Platform, Azure Active Directory, or Microsoft Entra, whichever name that you are familiar with it today. It's a continuation of the call we had last month, which was essentially covered the JavaScript React applications. This time we want to cover the Angular side of things. So without further ado, I will basically hand it over to Doan in my team, who would introduce himself and then himself and Salman, and then we can get forward. Doan?
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you very much, Kalyan. Hey everyone, I'm Doan. I'm a developer with the Identity Developer Guidance team. And I'll mainly work with JavaScript applications to integrate them with the Microsoft Identity Platform.
Hello, everyone. My name is Salman. I'm also a developer in the Identity Guidance team and looking forward to present for you guys.
All right. So let me start with briefly covering what we are going to discuss today. For those of you who attended the last month's call on React, this is going to be pretty similar, but we will focus on Angular instead. First, we will start with have an overview of MSAL.js and how MSAL Angular fit into this. Then we will look into using MSAL Angular in an Angular single-page application. And I will refer it as MSAL Angular, but it's actually the version 2 of our package. Our first target will be to enable single sign-on. Then we will attempt to get an access token for Microsoft Graph. Then Salman will talk us about what is continuous access evaluation and how you can handle those in your applications. And then we will finish the session with deploying our application to Azure Static Web Apps. At the end of the slide, there will be some next steps and references we will share with the deck, so you can take a look at those later on as well. All right, so very briefly, what is Microsoft Authentication Library for JavaScript? It's essentially a family of packages, family of libraries, targeting various kind of JavaScript applications and enables them to acquire access tokens and ID tokens for the Microsoft Identity Platform. It has two main branches. You have MSAL node on one side, which you can use with your applications running on server, as well as applications running on your on user's desktop and other kind of devices. And then you have your MSAL browser for any JavaScript application running in the browser. It has two wrapper packages on top of it. Last month we covered MSAL React, and this month we're going to focus on MSAL Angular and how to use that in an Angular application. So like MSAL browser, MSAL Angular acquires tokens using the authorization code grant with proof key for code exchange flow. The PXE is a mechanism that prevents authorization code replay attacks, so it's more secure than the previously used implicit flow. And then MSAL Angular supports Angular Applications 9, version 9, and later. We have some limited support for server-side rendering via Angular Universal. And it has the same public API with MSAL browser. So if you have used it before, you'll have access to the same APIs, same methods. But what it does is that it adds components, services, and observables on top to make your development experience more easy. So how to use your MSAL Angular in your applications? Your happy path would be you register an app on Azure AD. You download a code sample from our code samples, and then you start coding. So today, what I'm going to do, similar to the last time, is that this is going to be mostly a live coding session. I have a sample project here in my own repository, and you can go ahead and fork this repo. I would just recommend forking as opposed to cloning. And I will do the same. And yeah, we're going to start, and step by step, we're going to add authentication to this application. As always, let's cover some prerequisites. You'll need to have Node.js version 14 or later on your system. You're also going to need an Azure subscription, especially for deploying our apps to static web apps. And then you're going to need a GitHub account if you like to use GitHub to deploy your apps. OK, so I'll take a break from the slides here, and I'll show you what I have. So I cloned this project. It's a very simple Angular application. Let me go ahead and start this. I've generated this project using Angular CLI. I have an app module here, standard, with some components that I declare. I have two components, a home page and a profile page. I have a profile route to display the profile page and my home page route. And I have a service here that at the moment just displays some, returns some dummy data, but eventually we will replace this with an actual call to Microsoft Graph. So now my application started. Let me take a look at how it works. Localhost. There we go. So pretty simple. I have a navigation bar. I've used Material UI, Angular Material for this. Let's also keep our console open. I have a login and logout button. I have a text to identify the signed in user. Of course, we are not signed in at the moment. And then I have a profile page to display some dummy data. Right now, I'm using some dummy data, but I will eventually replace it. So let's go ahead and step by step add authentication to this guy. So I'll terminate this, and I'll begin by importing our dependencies. That'll be MSAL browser and MSAL Angular. And while this is happening, let's go to our app module. And here I'm going to instantiate my MSAL application object. And there are multiple ways of doing this. You could, for instance, use the MSAL module, the static method, to instantiate it. You could perhaps want to fetch some configuration data from some other server, some other location, and then instantiate MSAL. What I'm going to use is that I'm going to use the factory provider approach. So here I will pass my constant MSAL instance. And then I'll use the factory method to instantiate this guy. So I'll go ahead and create a very simple method here. This will return a MSAL instance. And what we're going to do, we're going to instantiate this class. Now, this class expects some configuration. I'll pass my configuration object here. At the very least, you'll need to have a client ID. And where do we get that? Of course, we will get this by registering an application on the Microsoft Identity Platform. So I'll go to my portal. And then I click the Azure Active Directory service. If you don't have it here, just use the search bar to look for it. I'll go ahead, I'll select the app registrations blade, and then I'm going to register a new app. I will call this MSAL Angular demo. And here I can select what kind of users I want to sign into my application. You have multiple options here. You want to go perhaps go with a multi-tenant application, or you may want to sign in a personal Microsoft account. I'm going to choose single tenant. I want to sign in the users in my own tenant. And then I need to select a redirect URI. And it has to be a single page application. So I'll go ahead and register my base URL. And now application is registered. I can see my client ID, application ID here. And I have my tenant ID here. As of interest, we have the authentication blade here, where you specify your redirect URIs. Let's add another one. So it's very important that every URI that you're going to use in your application, that MSAL is going to use in your application, has to be registered here. So if you have a sign out URI, that also has to be specified here. And then I'll go to API permissions. And I have a permission here for calling Microsoft Graph, the profile endpoint. And that is the permission that I'm going to need to acquire an access token for. OK, so I'll go back to my app. I'll copy this client ID. And I'll do this. And I'm getting an error here. Why? Because we didn't import this. So let's go ahead and do that. Let me take a moment here and discuss what kind of configuration options we have. So this object, the auth, will define your sign-in experience. So it's the most important part of configuring MSAL. And let me briefly go to slides here. So as I said, client ID will be the ID of the application registered on Azure AD. And then importantly, you have the authority parameter. This controls what kind of users that you can sign in into your application. So if you're developing a line of business application and you want to sign in the users in your own tenant, that will contain your tenant ID. And then you should specify a redirect URI. This is the URI that your application will receive the authorization code from Azure AD. And then you have some more options. We will get to that later on. But for now, these three should suffice. So I'll go back to my app. I'll specify the authority parameter. I don't want to use common. If I use common, that'll be a multi-tenant app, and I don't want this. I'll go back to my app registration, and I'll copy my tenant ID. And then I'll have a redirect URI here. You can specify the whole URI, or you can just specify a path, which is going to be better, actually, because later on, we're going to deploy this application, and then I don't want to come back and change this with the deployed application origin. So let me just use the auth route that is specified. OK, so yeah, this is now creating an MSAL instance and providing it to our Angular application. Now, what do I need? Well, I want to assign behavior to this login button. So I'll go ahead and do that now. Let's first start our application. And my login button is here. So I'll go here and I'll add a click behavior. Now I need to define this function. So I'll go to my app components. And there I have a, oh, of course. So let's create this function. And here I need to have access to the MSAL instance that we just created here. So how do I get access to that? You need to tell your Angular application that you're going to use MSAL service. Once you do that, you can go back to your components, use dependency injection, check this service. I'll do this. There we go. Now I can access this guy. instance. And so let me first show pop-up. So you have two options here for the sign-in experience. You could open a pop-up and sign the user in there, or you could direct the user to the Azure AD sign-in endpoint. So I'll show this pop-up first, and then I'm going to show you redirect, because that requires a bit more setup. Let's save this. This should compile nicely now. OK, so I'll go back to my app. And this should just work. So this is how pop-up works. Now it's trying to sign me into this account. I can go ahead and accept, and I can see here the permissions that I will consent once I click accept. So I'll do that. And now I'm signed in. Of course, there's nothing on my UI. There's no indication, and we'll come to fix to that. But I know I'm signed in because I can see that MSAL has, oops. Yeah, there it is. I can see that MSAL has stored the result from my sign-in operation. Now, what are these? These are your tokens and some other relevant information, and we'll come to discuss that in more detail. But let's first take a moment to show the redirect flow. So if I want to use redirect, the setup is a bit more, requires a bit more preparation. As always, any kind of login or acquire token method, I can pass a request parameter, request object, and you have many options there. I want users to sign into user read. This is the scope that I need to access Microsoft Graph profile endpoints. Now, if I want to use redirect, there's a few more things I want to do. First of all, what did we say? We said our redirect URI is the out route. So first, I need to declare that route. And then I need a component to handle the response in that route. So what Azure AD does, it's going to send you the authorization code to this path. And there we need to grab that code and handle it. And MSAL Angular actually does that for us. So we only have to pass this component here. This is a dedicated redirect handler. And also, we need to go back to our app module and bootstrap this component. Let's go ahead and import this. And this component targets a selector named app redirect on the page. So I need to add this guy somewhere on my HTML. And I'm going to do this here in my index HTML. So I'll go ahead and add this selector here. OK, now I'll go back to my page. I'll close this page, and I want to sign in again, this time using the redirect flow. As always, let's keep our console open. I click login. And then I'm signed in because I already had an active session with Azure AD. And now I want to step back here. And, well, I want to fix this UI because there's nothing that indicates on the UI that we are signed in. So let's fix that. So how can you do this? I'll go to my components. And I have already this variable here, which will eventually show the signed in user's ID or username. And I'm going to add another flag. And I want to set this flag to true when the user is signed in. So let's create a method here. And how should I do this? Well, if someone is signed in, if there's a signed in account in the cache, I should be able to get it from MSAL. There we go. This is the method that I could use to get the active account, but there needs to be an active account set in the first place, which we didn't yet, but we will do. Well, in that case, if there's no active account, but there are some accounts in the cache, I can say get all accounts, and I can check if this is greater than 0. Well, in that case, go ahead and make the active account the first account in this array. This will get you all the accounts in the cache, but they may not be active. You have to explicitly mark them as active. And then I'm going to use the MSAL service to set this as active account. Okay, after this, I can update this flag. Thank you, Copilots. And I can use the username from this account. Now, where should this function run, or when it should run, more appropriately? So whenever you're checking accounts in MSAL, or whenever you're using a login or acquire token APIs, you'll have to make sure that MSAL is not doing anything in that moment. And the way we can do this is that we can subscribe to the MSAL broadcast events, and they will tell us if there is any other action that MSAL is currently performing or not. So to do that, I'll use dependency injection to import this guy. There we go. And now that I do this, I also need to declare this as a provider. So I'll go to my app module. And let's import this. And I'll go back to my component, and now I can use this guy. So I want to do this when our component first mounts. Whenever our component renders, we want to check the current interaction status. And to do that, I need a lifecycle method. So I'm going to use ng-on-init. I'm also going to tell Angular I'm using it. And then I can access this broadcast event. I'll have the in progress observable there that tells me what's going on at any moment. I'll go ahead and filter out the status, which will be interaction status or type interaction status from MSAL. And I want to make sure that this only runs when there are no other interactions at the moment. And I also need to import this guy. So I'll go ahead. And this is coming from, oh, thank you. And once that happens, I can subscribe and run this code. All right. And now let's go ahead to our HTML and use these flags. I'll copy this first. I'll use the ngIf directive. And show this button when the user is not signed in. And show this button when the user is signed in. And same for this guy. So now we can conditionally render these elements. And I'll go back to my app and see what's happened there. Okay, there we go. So our UI is updated. We don't see the login button anymore. We have the identifying the currently signed in user. And so far, so good. Let's also add logout just for completing this. I just need another method here. All right. There's MSAL service, instance, logout. I'll use redirect again. And then I'll go ahead, my app component to add this guy. I'll add a click event here. There we go. Oops, why did you get rid of my ngIf? And logout. All right. So one thing here is that I didn't like the way of setting active account like this. You may need more complex logic here. I'm just getting the first account from the currently signed in accounts and setting this as active. But the better way to do this is actually subscribing to MSAL events. The better way to do this is actually setting the active account when the user first signs in. So MSAL allows you to subscribe to various kinds of events. The MSAL fires these events when they occur, and then you can take actions to handle them, or to update UI, or to make an API call, or whatever you want. And I want to use this login success event. I want to subscribe to this and set my active account when this fires. So I'll go back to my app. And I'll go here. So this broadcast service will allow me to access that guy. And this is going to be the MSAL subject observable. And there I want to filter out event, the login success event. Okay, but not like this. I need to import the event type enum. And then I'll have the login success here. Then I'll go ahead and subscribe to this guy. I'll have the same payload here. So when this event fires, we know that the user signed in, and there will be some result. There will be a response from Azure AD. So let's get that response. Let's store it in a variable. And I'll get the payload from this. And let me typecast this as authentication result. Okay, now I can actually set an active account properly. There we go. Now, there's one thing very important when you're subscribing to events. You'll have to make sure to unsubscribe them when your component unmounts. And the way to do this is essentially you're going to need another lifecycle event. So I'll just go ahead and do this. So this is important, especially for the performance of your application. So I'll define another lifecycle method here. And I'm going to use another observable. Let's call this unsubscribe. Nope. And this will be a new subject. I'll select void for now. And I'll go here and emit an event. Let's say undefined, so nothing goes red. All right. And then I can use this guy to, together with the take until operator. And that will make sure that I unsubscribe to these events when my component unmounts. Oops. Okay, I think this works. Now let's go to our application and see what's happening there. So I'm going to log out. All right. Now let's go ahead and log in. And let's log into Diego. I'll need to consent because it's the first time Diego signs in. And there we go. So we have our active user here. Our UI is correctly showing the elements we want it to show. And at this stage, I'll take a step back and discuss the single sign-on. So most of you are interested in how to have the most easy sign-in experience for your users, and you want this to be as simple as possible for them. So you probably don't want them to enter their credentials again if they're already signed in. And how does single sign-on works is that, well, when your user has an active session with Azure AD, say they signed into one application that is integrated with Azure AD, and then they come back to your another application and they try to sign in there. Since they have an active session with Azure AD, they would sign in without entering their credentials again. Now, if there are multiple active sessions with Azure AD, you'll see some kind of prompt that will tell the user to pick an account because Azure AD cannot know which account you want to sign in. And there are ways to bypass that. For instance, you can pass in a login hint to MSAL. And that will allow MSAL to pick the right account and sign your user directly in without seeing a prompt. So I'll take a step back and just show you how this works. So I have my application and my user signed in here. Now, if I go back to this tab, my user is not signed in this tab. And we can make this work out of the box very simple. And I'll come to that later on. But since I already have an active session here, if I click the login button, I should just sign in. There we go. So you just saw a brief flickering and transition, and then we immediately saw the UI updated. Now, you can actually avoid that flickering. MSAL offers you a method called SSO silent, which you have to pass a login hint or a session ID to that method. And that will ensure that there will be no interaction when your user is using SSO. However, this method will not work if you're using a browser that blocks third-party cookies. Why? Well, what happens when you sign into Azure AD is that Azure AD places a session cookie in your browser. And that cookie is associated with the domain of Azure AD, and that'll be login.microsoftonline.com. But that domain is different than the domain of your application, and so that cookie is considered a third-party cookie. And more browsers, Safari at first, and now Google in incognito, Chrome in incognito mode is blocking these kind of cookies. And more browser vendors will follow that. So you probably don't want to rely on SSO silent too much. And I'll take a break here and just check with you if you have any questions so far.
So we have a few questions to answer. One of them, starting with the first question is from Indranil, who is like, his question is if we define variables in our environment file. I think our samples basically have a configuration file that is separate from, that's where we would put your reply URLs and client IDs. And other than that,
definitely that's possible.
Question is, the next one is again in the chat is, do we need to pass the login hint as a query parameter or in the form of a header?
So how can you pass this? Let's say I'm going to switch to another branch. Well, maybe not.
We can just talk about it because we are kind of short on time.
Sure. The way you can pass this is, where's our login method? There it is. So this is one of the parameters you can pass here. Now, if you're asking the question, where am I going to get this guy? Well, this is really up to you. Your application, for instance, might have, let's say you have a company portal and you have a link to your Angular application here. You can redirect to this application with some query parameter and a user ID here. And then in your application, you can grab this and then pass it to MSAL. That way, MSAL would know which account that it needs to sign in the user into. So that's one possible way.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is from Abdul Qadir, which is, can the pop-up or redirect work inside an iframe?
Okay. Yeah, so this is a tricky aspect. Most of the time, the iframe is possible, authentication in iframe is possible, but you'll have to have an additional configuration for MSAL. I would recommend checking out our iframe documentation, and let me show you where it is. And that should answer most of your questions.
Can you copy paste this into the chat window, please? The next question is, what information is present in the session cookie that is placed by Azure AD into the browser? It's a server-side cookie. It contains proprietary encrypted information that Azure AD uses to essentially ascertain everything from whether a user should be signed on using single sign-on to things like that are related to identity protection, risk analysis, and things of that nature. We do not publish information on how this cookie works, whether it will have a certain behavior associated with it, depending upon where the user is and how they are interacting with Azure AD today. Because unfortunately, that information helps the bad actors more than it actually helps the developers. And that's the best answer I have for this. The Next question we have is, how does this change in a B2C context? Jason, do you want to explain that question a little bit more for us?
No, just the question was along the lines of, if you're using Azure AD B2C as opposed to directly Azure AD, what other configuration needs to happen?
So do you want to cover that one?
Sure. The most important aspect, if you're signing it with B2C, is going to be authority parameter. This will contain your tenant domain, B2C tenant domain, followed by the policy that you are using to sign in your users. We have many B2C samples. Please go ahead and take a look at them. We'll share the links at the end. But essentially, it boils down to your authority parameter, and that will control which tenant you're signing into, whether in Azure AD or in B2C. And this will look slightly different if you're using B2C as your identity provider.
Do we have a link to a B2C sample for Angular that you can share in the chat?
Of course.
So
Let's
the next
go
question
here.
I will take while Doan is looking for a link is it possible to start MSAL redirect from sign-in and redirect back to a different URL? So the question here is that Azure AD, when you are at Azure AD and you want Azure AD to redirect to a certain URL, obviously that's one of the parameters that you provide. How you manage it is up to you, but just remember this, that Azure AD will not redirect you to any URL that is not registered or provided in the redirect URI section of the app registration. So if you want to redirect the user after signing to a certain URL, or if you want it to be very dynamic, or if there is you want to save the state of where the user was before the sign-in happened, those are things that you have to basically code for yourself. Does that answer your question, Bill?
An additional we can add on this is that MSAL will not allow you to, if you start your authentication from one domain and you try to end up on another domain, MSAL will not allow that.
Did that answer your question, D? I suppose we can continue chatting about it. Next question is from Muralidharan. Can we embed MSAL.js to build Power Platform component framework controls? We don't have an answer to this really, is mostly because we are a platform and we have an authentication library. How does it get used by various other products within Microsoft and from others out there isn't necessarily in our control. We would suggest you look into their documentation we suggest you look into the Power Platform team's documentation on how they suggest you use MSAL in their development framework. Okay, so we are good now, and let's move to discussing the ID token in a little bit more detail. Doan, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So what is the significance of authentication? The event of signing in is that you receive, well, there's a session cookie that Azure places on your app, but you shouldn't rely on it in any way. But the most significant outcome is that you obtain an ID token. And that ID token is the proof that your user signed in appropriately. Now, for instance, I can see my ID token here in MSAL cache here. And if this is the encoded base64 encoded JSON web token. And if I want to encrypt this, this is my test tenant, so I will do this, but you shouldn't share this string anywhere else. And then you can decode this guy and see the payload in that token. So I want to discuss these claims in a bit more detail. So I'll go back to my slides. So what do you have here? Well, first of all, you have your audience claim. And this signifies which application this token was issued for. And that is going to be your client application. In this case, it's going to be the client ID we used in our demo app. Then you have your issuer that tells you for which tenant this token was issued. You'll have your, if the user belongs to some security groups, they will appear here in the groups claim. You'll have the name of the user. You'll have a unique immutable identifier of the user in a tenant. If the user belongs to some roles, you'll have that in the claim. You'll see the user's tenant ID, which tenant this user belongs to. And you'll have any Azure AD roles if they are assigned to the user. And you can use this information to customize your UI in any way, but you shouldn't use an ID token to access a web API. That is what an access token is for. Any particular questions about ID tokens?
We have some questions around caching, but it's better if you go and cover that slide itself. It would help.
Sure. Okay, so I want to take back here and discuss more about caching. I show you this cache that MSAL is keeping, but what are these things and is it secure? So, and what are the possible options for caching that you can use? So caching is configured in the public client application instance we have here. Under the cache field, you can specify the cache location. So for instance, so far we've been using session storage, but you can choose another thing. You can choose if you want to store the authentication state, not the tokens, but the authentication state, whether you're signed in or not, in a cookie. And this could help with some browsers that are having issues with the redirect flow. And in general, caching is for storing the artifacts that Azure AD returns to your application. As I said, default is session storage, but you have the local storage and also the memory storage options. The trade-off here is that, well, you make a trade-off between more secure and better user experience. So memory storage would be the most secure one because essentially MSAL does not cache items anywhere else but the memory. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have the local storage, which gives you the best user experience because now your application, now the instances of your application running on different tabs will have access to the same cache. So if you're signed in one tab, and if you go to another tab, open the application on another tab, you'll see your app signed in immediately without doing anything because they are sharing now the same cache location. These local storage and session storage are considered secure as long as your applications do not have vulnerabilities against cross-site scripting. And you should check out the OS cheat sheet for that to make sure that your applications don't have such vulnerabilities. And on top of that, there are other mechanisms from Azure AD to make sure that your tokens cannot be used by a malicious actor. So for instance, your tokens issued to single page applications are usually for 1 hour access tokens and 24-hour for refresh and ID tokens. MSAL has some extra mechanisms to prevent token replay attacks. So proof of possession is one such mechanism. It binds your token to your browser cryptographically, and it cannot be used outside of that browser. And then we have continuous access evaluations that allows resources, web APIs, to invalidate an access token at any moment in time. And this is what we are going to discuss. Salman will talk about in later. So I'll continue with this. And then I want to talk about what kind of artifacts are in the cache. Well, we already discussed that we have ID tokens and access tokens are in the cache. On top of that, we have refresh tokens. We have account objects that MSAL creates. Then we have some temporary data like request metadata, errors, the current interaction status, and etc. And then we have some entries for telemetry. So if you want more details on this, feel free to take into our documentation. There'll be more information about caching there. Finally, I want to talk about logging. So MSAL allows you to log whatever it's doing at any moment at various levels of details. And these logs are useful for understanding what's going on and debugging if anything goes wrong with your application. And likewise, you configure this in the public client application instance. So I can have a system here with logger options here. Oops. And then I can have a logger callback. You can customize this callback as you like. I'm just going to console or message. And then you can specify a log level. Let's say select verbose. And now if I go back to my application, I will see that MSAL is logging what's going on. And this is very useful for debugging if something goes wrong with your application. Any particular question about this?
Okay, let's go to the Microsoft Graph part of it, and then I'll take the questions in the chat. Okay.
Sure. Okay. So let's continue. So far we discussed MSAL service and MSAL broadcast service. Now let's discuss the MSAL guards. remember, we have a route in our application, profile route, that doesn't require authentication at this moment. I can just sign out and review this route. And you don't want this. You want to protect your routes and allow only the authenticated user to see that route. And it's very easy to do with Angular, MSAL Angular. All I have to do is that I need to activate the MSAL guard component in the route that I want to protect. If you like, you can add this to your homepage as well. So that means as soon as the user hits your application, they will have to sign in. But importantly, do not add this to your redirect URI because this will just break it. And I then go to my app module and declare this as a provider. Oops. And let's also import this guy. Now I need to configure the guards, and you have many possible configuration options. I'll use a factory method as well to configure this guy. Let's call this MSAL guards config factory. And I'll create a very simple method here. This will return a guard configuration. And then return. Okay, so what do I need to return? Well, let's take a look at the guard configuration. Here, I can specify an interaction type. If the user is not signed in and the MSAL guard kicks in, I can specify what kind of interaction I want the guard to use. So I'll go ahead and I'm going to choose redirect here as well. I like redirect. Let's import this. And then optionally, you can pass in an authentication request. So for instance, you can specify here what scopes the user should consent to if they hit the MSAL guards. You can specify more options here. Take a look at those and how you can use that in your application. And once I have this factory method, oops, there's one thing I'm missing here. Okay, so now this should just work. Let's try it out. I'll go to my app. I'm not signed in. I'll go to profile, and the guard kicks in. And I'll sign in to Diego. All right, so I think we covered all things related to authentication itself. Now, let's actually acquire an access token and call Microsoft Graph and get rid of this dummy data here. So if you're familiar with MSAL browser before, you can just go ahead in your components and use MSAL directly to acquire a token. But MSAL Angular makes this easier for you. It has an interceptor component class that allows you to intercept the outgoing calls and attach an access token if you specify that it's required that. So the way I do this, I'll go into my providers here again. First, I'll tell Angular that I'm using HTTP interceptors. And then I'm going to use the class MSAL interceptor. Let's import this. And there could be multiple of those, so I'll just say multi-true. And I also need to configure this. So I'll pass in my configuration similarly. I'll use a factory method here. Nope, interceptor factory. Let's not forget this and create our factory method here. Interceptor configuration. Okay, so now this guy should return, let's see what it should return. An interaction type, similarly. So this time I want to use pop-up. And then it should have a protected resources map. Okay, I'll go ahead and create something like that, and I'll talk about more in what this is. Thank you. Let me actually get the full type here. Okay, and let's import this. So this map allows you to associate an endpoint, for instance, the Microsoft Graph profile endpoint, with a certain scope. And MSAL understands that to access this endpoint, I need an access token with this scope or permission. And I'll go ahead and do this. First, let me pass this guy here. And then the way to do this is, oh, okay, right here, yeah. So basically, I'm telling that whenever you are accessing this endpoint, get an access token with the scope. And I can pass in more parameters here. I can customize it a bit further. For instance, I can specify the HTTP method that the interceptor should intercept. And there are a couple more configuration options that you can find in our documentation. Okay, so now that I have this, the interceptor is configured. I'll go to my service and use dependency injection to get a handle on the the HTTP client. Sorry, we need a HTTP client for the calls. And once I do that, I can get rid of this guy. Oops. Okay. Well, that's not the endpoint. And let's replace this with the graph endpoint. There we go. And this should just work. Okay, I'll go back to my app. Oh, there we go. It's here. We already updated this data from the user's profile on Microsoft Graph.
Thank you, Duan. Yeah. So we are a little short on time here, so we will quickly switch to continuous access evaluation. Please, if you have any questions around how Microsoft Graph is used, please go ahead and use the chat window. So Sal, if you want to get started.
Sure. I'll give control to Sal here.
Hello, everyone. One of the features that we would like to introduce to you today is continuous access evaluation, CAE. CAE allows Microsoft Graph to revoke an active session and respond to security events like account revocation, account displacement, or user location change, or user risk increase. We encourage admins to enable CAE in their tenants because Microsoft Graph will reject your access token and send back a claim challenge. Developers must understand how to handle claim challenge sent by Microsoft Graph. Which leads me to my next item, how to handle claim challenges. As you can see in the graph, the client sends the refresh token to Azure to receive an access token for the Graph API. When a security event is triggered, Azure will notify the resource provider, in this case, Microsoft Graph. The next time that the client tries to access the Graph API, the access token will be rejected. When the Graph API rejects the access token, it will send a response with a status 401. From this response authenticated header, we'll extract the encoded claim. This claim is called claim challenge. We'll decode this claim and pass it to MSAL acquire token API to re-authenticate the user and acquire a new access token. So let's go to the steps of enabling a CAE in your application. The first step that we need to do is to configure MSAL app to declare it as capable of handling claim challenge. Then we will grab the authenticated header from the 401 response. After that, we'll process the header and pass the claims to the MSAL as a request parameter. Now we can dive into the code a little bit. Unfortunately, we can't test CAE live because it takes around 10 to 15 minutes to trigger.
Just a moment. Okay, let's slash our changes and close this guy. And I'm going to switch to another branch. All right.
So the first thing that we need to see is the auth configuration file.
All right, there we go.
As you can see in the MSAL configuration object, we set the client capabilities to CP1. That lets the resource owner know that the client is capable of handling claim challenge. So you need to add this in your configuration. And then we'll go to the profile components. This is the same request that Dugan did like a few minutes ago when calling Graph API. The only difference here, we instantiate Graph services. Let's go to the Graph services class. As you can see here, when we send a request to Graph, a me endpoint, if there is an error with the status 401, we check the header if it's include the authenticated header. If it does, we will handle the claim challenge. What do we mean by handling claim challenge? We're just going to extract the claim challenge from the header. and then store it in the session storage. Storing the claim challenge is optional. It's up to you guys. How do you want to handle it? Where do you want to save it? And how do you want to do it in your UI? After storing the claim challenge, we'll pass the claim challenge to the acquired token interaction, which is at this point at the redirect. It will re-authenticate the user and give him a fresh new token. We also want to look at the interceptor because it's an important step there. Next time, like the user wants to acquire a new token, we'll check the storage if it includes the claim. If the claim exists, we'll add it to the acquired token and we will receive the right access token with the required claims to access the Graph API. The benefits of doing this is like at any certain point in time, Graph can reject your access token and ask the user to basically get a fresh new token and re-authenticate. I will give the control back to Dugan. He will walk you through how to deploy the application that we just built.
We will skip the deployment steps. I would suggest we go through the tutorial to understand that because we're kind of out of time.
Sure.
We'll take any remaining questions if you have them. And I did provide a link to code that we have ready for you to essentially handle CAE. So yeah, if you guys want to basically have any remaining questions, so let's go through those, and we can then close this session. We will publish the PowerPoint slide on the Yammer community channel. Minhaj.
We will also do it on the identity platform blog, as well as the YouTube video. Yep. So if you see this current slide right now, you can just go to those M365 PNP videos, which will have the link, as well as follow us on those channels, 365 Dev and Azure AD, to get these updates. And one quick request would be to fill in the survey, because we will need your responses. If you think these are great sessions, you would love such sessions, please go ahead and give in a survey response. This will really help us, having the right kind of call setup for you. And any other feedback that you have, feel free to put it in the survey. Okay, we have a question from Jared. Is CAE supported in other SDKs, in other MSAL SDKs?
Yes, all MSAL SDKs have add claims or add additional claims or request additional claims. The names kind of change between them, but you're looking for essentially a method that would be in the respective MSAL documentation around how to request additional claims from AAD, which is what how you handle CAE events. Okay, if you missed any questions, please do not hesitate to copy paste it again in the chat window.
If you don't see any, come off mute and ask it.
Or you can come off mute and ask it. That's a good idea.
So we have our next call coming up on September 15. It's going to be on claims, so feel free to tune into the same calendar invite or the link that you have, and we would love to host you there as well and take up your questions or any other information that you need on claims. And here is our calendar invite for folks who don't have it. Feel free to download that and join in every third Thursday of the month. And Kalyan has shared the tutorial for you folks.
Thank you, guys. Yes, so everything that we have covered, including steps that we couldn't cover, like deployment, is laid out in the Angular series tutorial that we have available. Please go through that. And if you have any questions, you can use the issues tab to reach back to us. We'll be happy to answer your questions. And thank you very much for joining the call today. We really enjoyed your presence here.
Thanks a lot, Kalyan. Thanks, Dogan, and thanks, Salman. Talk to you all.
Thanks, Nandish. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Nandish. Thank you, everyone.